His research and teaching focus on Vedic studies, Buddhist studies, Ayurveda and classical Sanskrit literature. He has written, translated and edited 17 books and 71 research and popular articles. Presently, he is working on several research projects on Vedic and Buddhist Sanskrit texts. Now, I would like to request Professor Shrikant Balhukar, please present your paper on contribution of Professor L.M. Joshi to editions and translations of Buddhist works.
Participants of this seminar, online and offline. I'll speak a few words on the contribution of Professor Lalmani Joshi with special reference to his editions and translations. I'll focus on two important books Professor Joshi edited and translated, namely Vajracchedakaprajnaparamita and Vimalakirti Nirdesha Sutra. The first edition includes two small but important books. The Vajracchedakaprajnaparamita Sutra and Asanga's commentary on that sutra, namely Trishati Prajnaparamita Karika Saptati. The second work is Vimalakirti Nirdesha Sutra, which was lost in its original Sanskrit. Professor Joshi, on the basis of the Tibetan translation, offered an excellent translation in Hindi. Bhikshu Prasadiko, although we know him as Bhikkhu Prasadiko, in the edition of Vimalakirti Nirdesha Sutra, the name is Sanskritized, and that's why I am using that Sanskritized name. Bhikshu Prasadiko, a renowned German scholar, restored that work into Sanskrit. In recent years, it has been edited on the basis of the manuscript of that work that was discovered in Tibet, in Potala Palace. It was edited by Japanese scholars and published from Japan. It has also been edited on the basis of a copy of the same manuscript by a team of scholars at the Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies, Sarnath. The team of scholars included the late Professor Ram Shankar Tripathi, advisor, Professor Pradeep Gokhale, chief editor, and others as co-editors. I'll speak first on the Vajracchedakaprajnaparamita and Asanga's commentary on that work. In his introduction in Hindi to this edition, Professor Joshi explains the methodology he adopted. I summarize his explanation in English. He says, the first work, namely the Vajracchedika, is reproduced in Sanskrit as the original text, and some important variants and corresponding passages from other works have been given in the footnotes. Then follows a lucid Hindi translation of the sutra along with explanatory and comparative footnotes. The same method has been adopted in the edition of Asanga's Karika Saptati. At the outset, Professor Joshi explains why he made a Hindi translation of the two works. As he says, these two works that represent the Prajnaparamita literature are being edited for the first time in Nagari, and the Hindi translation has also been offered for the first time. The purpose of the Hindi translation is twofold. First, it's a service unto Sadharma, and also service unto the national language Hindi. Secondly, this modest attempt has been made to facilitate the Indians who are interested in studying Buddhism. The work also includes a bibliography of important works, a glossary of technical terms, and index of proper names and topics. Both the works under review include a detailed and scholarly introduction. In his introduction to Vajracchedakaprajnaparamita, Professor Joshi explains the meaning of the term Vajra. He points out that some Western scholars have translated the word Vajra as diamond cutter or diamond sutra, which does not seem a proper translation. Saying that the Prajnaparamita cuts even Vajra gives a vague meaning. The word Vajra is translated into English as diamond or thunderbolt. However, this is not a correct meaning. This Vajra is a mystic Vajra in its Shunyata Vajramuchyate. This is a sword in the form of prajna that cuts asunder defilements, klesha, and ignorance, avidya. In the Dhamma Samgadi, prajna is called as prajna panya sattva, in Sanskrit prajna shastra. Prajna that takes one to the other shore is called prajna paramita. Asanga's commentary has 300 verses and is therefore called Trishatika. After explaining the titles, Professor Joshi attempts to ascertain the date of the work. It is always a difficult task to say definitely about the date of the composition of Sanskrit works. As William Dwight Whitney says in the introduction to his Sanskrit grammar, all dates given in Indian literary history are pins set up to be bowed down again. However, in the case of Buddhist works, there is some help, especially from the earlier translations into Chinese. The Vajracchedika was first translated into Chinese around the 4th century CE by Kumarajiva. Some manuscripts of this work were found in Gilgit and Central Asia. According to N.P. Chakravarti, the date of the Gilgit manuscripts is 5th century CE. Professor Joshi thinks that this work was composed in an early stage, sometime later after the composition of early Mahayana works. He argues that this work does not compare the Hinayana and the Mahayana, nor does it highlight the supremacy of the latter. The work does not discuss the concept of Shravaka and Pratyeka Buddha, while later Mahayana works frequently do so. According to him, the work was composed after the composition of the Ashtasahasrikaprajnaparamita, because, as Edward Ponce points out, there are at least 8 places in this work where one can trace the influence of the thought found in the Ashtasahasrika. The date of the Ashtasahasrika is regarded to be 2nd century BCE. The Vajracchedika was translated by Kumarajiva around the 4th century CE. Professor Joshi therefore thinks that the Vajracchedika was composed around the 2nd or the 3rd century CE. This is quite a logical conclusion. The edition of this work is prepared with utmost care and understanding. The work begins with a benediction, Namas Sarvajnaya, salutations to the omniscient one. The editions of Max Muller, Edward Ponce, and P.L. Vaidya have a different benediction. It is Namo Bhagavatyai Prajnaparamitaye. However, Professor Joshi accepts the benediction that is found in the Tibetan translation of the work and some manuscripts in Japan, as this is more reliable. Asanga's work, Trishatikaya Prajnaparamitaaya Karika Saptati, is the only available commentary on that work. As the title says, this is composed in 70 verses. As a matter of fact, this has 77 verses. Therefore, it should have been called as Trishatika Sapta Saptati. However, one can accept the age-old convention and designate it as Karika Saptati. There are some works that are titled as Shataka, a collection of 100 verses, but actually have more than 100. It was Professor G. Tucci, a great Indian scholar, who discovered a manuscript of that work in the Ngor monastery in Tibet and brought out an edition of that work in Roman with its English translation. There is a Chinese translation of this commentary made by Itzi. In that translation, the title of this work is Vajracchedakaprajnaparamita Sutra Shastra Karika. There exists a work in the Tibetan Tripitaka that is almost identical with the original Sanskrit work. The title is Vajracchedikayaha Prajnaparamitayaha Vyakhyana Upanibandhana Karika. Vasubandhu, the younger brother of Asanga, wrote a sub-commentary on that work. It is available only in its Chinese translation. Professor Joshi then discusses a very important topic, the meaning of prajna and evolution of the thought of Prajnaparamita. While discussing these topics, he quotes from and refers to various original works in Pali and Sanskrit and those by modern scholars. He points out that the word prajna or Pali panya has variously been translated into English as knowledge, wisdom, insight, gnosis, intuition, transcendental idealism, spiritual enlightenment, and so on. In Sanskrit, the word jnana is used as a synonym of prajna. In Tibetan, it is translated as shedap. The opposite of prajna is avidya. Prajna chakshu, the eye of wisdom, is transcendental, and the number of those having prajna is very limited. There are 3 constituents of the path leading to nirvana: Shila, Samadhi, and Prajna. The faculty of Prajna is one of the 5 faculties, Pancha Indriyani, and the power of Prajna is one of the 5 powers, Pancha Balani. The Tathagata is endowed with 10 powers, out of which the first is the power of Prajna. By means of Prajna, one realizes the nature of phenomena as they are. Yatha bhutam prajanati. Professor Joshi then quotes extensively from Pali and Sanskrit Buddhist texts in order to justify his argument. The word paramita is rarely found in the Pali canon. The word prajna paramita can be traced to Sariputta Theragatha. Prajna paramita means perfection of wisdom or climax of wisdom. It is one of the 10 paramitas in the ancient Savidavada tradition. After the discussion on the Prajna Paramita, Professor Joshi deals with yet another important topic, namely Prajna Paramita literature. He is of the opinion that the Prajna Paramita Sutras came into existence in South India around the 2nd century BCE. The Mahayana is called Prajnanaya, which also originated in South India and then developed in the eastern and the northern part of it. It was Nagarjuna who wrote commentaries on the Prajnaparamita. It's possible to say that the oldest Prajnaparamita works were first composed in the Prakrit language and then were made available in their Sanskrit versions. There is also some evidence for this in the Tibetan tradition. Secondly, one can see the influence of the Prakrit language on the Buddhist Sanskrit words. There are several sutra texts under the name Prajnaparamita. In his work titled Prajnaparamita Literature, Edward Consey mentions as many as 40 texts under the name Prajnaparamita. It is difficult to say which of these works can be considered as the first one. Professor Joshi thinks that the Ashtasahasrika Prajnaparamita is the oldest one and that the Prajnaparamita Shastra of Nagarjuna, which is available in its Chinese translation, is the first commentary on that text. According to him, the Ashtasahasrika was composed in the 2nd century BCE and Nagarjuna's Prajnaparamita Shastra was composed toward the end of the 1st century CE. This essay, in the form of the introduction to edition of Vajracchedaka, is an important survey of the Prajnaparamita literature made available in Hindi for the first time. Now I turn to the second work, namely the Vimalakirti Nirdesha Sutra, edited by Bhikshu Prasadika and Professor Lalmani Joshi. This is an important publication in which we find for the first time a Sanskrit restoration of the text on the basis of its Tibetan translation. It was published in 1981 under the general editorship of Venerable Samdong Rinpoche by the Central and published by the Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies, Sarnath, as Buddhist Bibliotheca Indo-Tibetica Volume 5. It consists of a publisher's note in Hindi and Tibetan by Venerable Samdong Rinpoche, the then director of Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies, Sarnath, followed by a foreword and a preface. Then follows an analysis of contents, namely that of the 12 chapters of the sutra. Then an analysis of the contents of the introduction to the sutra in English. Then follows Bhumika, the introduction in Hindi, that runs over 64 pages. I'll speak about it later. Then we have the text of the sutra restored in Sanskrit. It is covered in 120 pages. Then follows the contents of the Hindi translation of the sutra text that runs over 169 pages. Then there is an extensive bibliography of the books and articles that includes primary sources in Pali and Sanskrit, secondary sources namely books, articles and bibliographies in English, French, German and Japanese. Index of proper names, including the primary sources mentioned in the introduction. Then follows the Tibetan text of the sutra in the Tibetan script. In this first edition of the sutra, jointly prepared by these two stalwarts, Bhikshu Prasadika prepared the foreword, the Sanskrit restoration of the sutra and the edition of the Tibetan text. Professor Joshi wrote the preface, the introduction in Hindi translation of the sutra, bibliography and index of proper names. Thus, this edition of the sutra, meticulously prepared by these two scholars, is a valuable addition to the excellent works done by modern scholars in the field of Buddhist studies. The commentary of the community of scholars is grateful to the editors for their painstaking efforts and to the authorities of the Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies that took initiative and brought out the publication of this important work. In his foreword, Bhikshu Prasadika highlights the importance of the introduction and the translation of the sutra Professor Joshi prepared. He says at the outset, I quote, judging by the number of people at least who speak Hindi, this North Indian vernacular is a world language ranging only after English and Chinese. It is a matter of rejoicing that through his introduction and translation, Professor Ellen Joshi has, no pains spared, made the famous Vimalakirti Nirdesha Sutra accessible also to the Hindi-speaking public. It is to be hoped that his meticulous and at the same time beautiful Hindi translation will evoke at home considerable interest in if not a little fascination for that Zen classical of India. In the Bhumika or the introduction, Professor Joshi discusses many important topics. General introduction and summary of the sutra, citation from the Vimalakirti Nirdesha in Buddhist texts such as Sutra Samuchaya, Shiksha Samuchaya, Prasanna Pada, Ratna Gotra Vibhaga Sutra, Kamarashila's first and third Bhavana Krama, Sarva Tathagata Sangraha, and Udrushti Nirbhata. Literary translation, this third point is literal translation of the Vajracchedakaprajnaparamita that can be traced in ancient translations, such as Chinese, Tibetan, Soviet, and Bhutanese, Chinese commentaries, Shotoku's Japanese commentary, modern translations and studies of Kumarajiva's Chinese translation, Robinson's English translation, contribution by Yamaguchi, Hashimoto, Mochizuki, and others in Japanese, Yamada Momon's Japanese translation, Chinese texts edited with Japanese translation by Fukumi Shogun, Potinanta's Thai translation, English translation, Lamo's study, and French translation of the Tibetan version, Oshika's edition and philosophical studies of the Tibetan version, Bhikshu Prasadika's edition of the Tibetan version and a Sanskrit restoration, Robert Thurman's English translation from the Tibetan, Sarah Bowen's English rendering of Lamoth's French version, and lastly, the study and translation into Hindi made by Professor Joshi himself. Fourth point, in the fourth section of the introduction, Professor Joshi elaborates on the arrangement of chapters and the style of the sutra, where he holds discussion on the Chinese editions of 14 and the Tibetan tradition of 12. Chinese tradition of 14 and the Tibetan tradition of 12 chapters. He also writes about the elucidation of pains of opposites and humor and sarcasm in the Vimalakirti Nirdesha. In section 5, Professor Joshi discusses the question of Vimalakirti's historicity. Vimalakirti in the history of Buddhism, Buddhist faith, historical places, persons, and situation in the sutra and traditions of Vimalakirti's house and family. In the section 6, Professor Joshi offers his views on the date of the Vimalakirti Nirdesha Sutra. According to him, the Vimalakirti Nirdesha, Ashtasahasrika, Kashyapa Parivarta, and Sadharma Pundarika Sutra are among the oldest sutras of the Bodhisattva Pitaka, and the possible date of the Vimalakirti Nirdesha would be the 1st century BCE. In section 7, he produces comparable and parallel passages and shows remarkable correspondence between the Pali Nikayas and the Vimalakirti Nirdesha. He also includes Bhikshu Prasadika's views on Chitta Gahapati as a precursor of Vimalakirti. In section 8, Professor Joshi shows correspondence between Vimalakirti Nirdesha and numerous Mahayana and non-Buddhist Sanskrit sutras, shastras and tantras. This is shown through tables of comparable and parallel passages cited in the footnotes to the English translation. In section 9, Professor Joshi shows through comparable passages the influence of the Vimalakirti Nirdesha on Chinese masters of Chan and Japanese masters of Zen, and correspondence between the Vimalakirti Nirdesha and the Buddhist Tantric text. In section 10, he discusses the religion and philosophy of the Vimalakirti Nirdesha in 7 topics. 1. Conception of the Buddha. 2. Conception of the Dharma. 3. Conception of the Sangha. 4. Bodhisattva's religion. 5. Bodhisattva's philosophy. 6. Exposition of non-dual truth by means of silence. And 7. Meaning of Buddha field and importance of Sangha. Thus, we get ample food for thought. Through these 2 translations, introductions, Professor Joshi wrote. During the short span of his life of just 48 years actually, Professor Lalmani Joshi wrote, edited and translated as many as 10 books. Some of them have been reprinted. It is necessary to find a way to make all his books available. I am, however, aware that it is not an easy task. Professor Lalmani Joshi passed away on July 15, I suppose, it is written 16, but maybe 15, 1984. After his unexpected and sudden demise, there appeared obituaries in internationally reputed journals such as the Journal of the International Association of Buddhist Studies, edited by Professor A.K. Narayan, and it was written by N.H. Samtani and Robert Thurman, and the Tibet Journal, Dharamsala, the obituary was written by Bhikkhu Pasai. I would like to end this brief speech by quoting from the obituary Bhikshu Prasadika. He says, I quote, everything Joshi wrote was inspired by a deep personal involvement in the doctrine of the Buddha. Through his work and teaching, he has brought many to a better understanding of the doctrines and beliefs of Buddhism. His example and his work will continue to inspire future generations to study and explore the Buddhist scriptures. L.N. Joshi was a prolific author. A large portion of his writings appeared as articles or book reviews in journals. It is to be hoped that one day all his articles, reviews and conference papers will be republished together in book form. Joshi also left behind many articles and papers, even the manuscript of a book in Hindi on ancient Indian history or of art that have never been published. All this material, no doubt, merits timely posthumous publication. I am reminded of a sentence from a Sanskrit play, Vimalakirti, written by Mahakavi Bhasa. He says, "Na khalu sa uparataha yasya vallabho janas smrati." He is not gone whom his beloved ones remember. I think this seminar, organized in the loving memory of Professor Lalmani Joshi, is an appropriate tribute to him. It will, let us hope, inspire younger generation to go through his works, understand his views and follow his path to the extent possible.